I want to thank everybody first for coming out. I know it's a rainy night, there aren't many of you, and so I'll go through the slides, and somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes, depending on how quickly I talk, and then leave the rest of the time for questions. And this is part one of many explanations of the charter, and the reason why I titled that way is I wasn't sure how long it was going to take to get through explaining the charter. We've, prior to starting the school, started talking about what the school would be like and what was going to be in the charter for years. But one of the things I've learned is you can't explain your vision and mission enough. There's always new families coming into the school. There are always aspects of it that people don't know. So my goal is to create a series of presentations. This is the first one of many. And over the next couple of years, really talk about all the aspects of the charter. The idea being that one day the original founders will move on, their kids will age out, and we need to make sure that the next group of parents really understands what the original founders' vision and mission was in great detail. And so we'll take an overview tonight of all the aspects of the charter, and then I'll answer questions. And then we will, over a period of time, probably every month or every other month, we'll have more of these going into the next school year to really explain every aspect in greater depth than what this overview presentation is tonight. So with that, we'll go to the first slide. So if you saw on the email blast that we sent out, there's a question: what in the world does our charter have to do with the space race? And so we'll start with history. We're a good classical school, so we might as well start with history. So in 1961, John F. Kennedy gave a speech, a very famous speech, that was largely credited with launching, from the American side, the space race. And he said something very interesting. He said, "I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." Does anyone remember why he said that and what caused that speech to be said? What was the precipitating event? Sputnik, right? And Sputnik has a lot to do with our school. It actually has a lot to do with the education reform movement, because it launched a renewed interest in American education. Prior to that, we thought we were doing pretty well, but then the Russians beat us, and the question was asked, well, since the Russians are beating us, what is it about their educational system that's better than ours? They're ahead of us. So this was our moonshot. We as a nation endeavored to do this because we really wanted to beat the Russians. And so our charter is kind of like the same thing. We saw a lot of challenges in our educational system, and we thought we would take our moonshot, which is to start this charter. And as you know, it's a very challenging state in which to start a charter, and very challenging local environment at the time that we started. And we had to get over a lot of obstacles. So this charter is kind of like our moonshot, and that's how our charter relates to the space race. So there's a couple parts to this. There's only a few slides per part. There's about 5 parts to this presentation. And the first one I asked is, why start a charter? And so we entered into the realm of classical education. There are different paths that people go when they become interested in classical education. Some will start in a more philosophical way. Some will start because they like the uniforms or the sense of discipline, the sense of decorum. Some will start with the academics. They like the way that classical education teaches things. For us, our journey actually started with research. So we actually, those of us who were interested in this, had been doing a lot of research for many, many years into what instructional methodologies work, and also into data about where our education system was headed. So I think these are mostly all new slides, so there's one person here that's seen this slide, I think, before. And so we looked at the national challenge that we have here in this country. And so if you listen to the regular public schools describe what they see as the challenges in public education, they largely point to one thing: spending. We're just not spending enough on our schools. We don't value education enough. That is often the main argument that you hear from educators and also from people running for Board of Education. Spending is really a priority issue in many people's minds. But this graph is really interesting. This is the American public schooling since 1970, and these are the percentages. So here's where we started, and this total cost line here going all the way up here to what is about 108% or so. That's the percentage we have increased our spending, adjusted for inflation, in that time period. So that's a lot in 40 years to have gone and increased our total cost this much. We have increased our number of employees this much. That's almost doubling it at 100. It's right around 90%. And so that's a huge investment in public education. And no one's disputing we should invest in public education, but look at this line here, the enrollment line. So we've increased our employees this much, but our enrollment is basically flat, a little bit elevated from where we started, but not much, a single-digit %. And then superimposed here are also the growth in the test scores, and you can see they're all here at the bottom. So we've increased the number of employees, so that means we've reduced class size, right? Because we've kept the enrollment about the same. So we've actually reduced class size over the last 40 years. And we've dramatically increased spending, and achievement's basically flat. So that's a big challenge to have done that. All right, then we have, this is another little known fact, we have the second highest spending in the world. Here we are, compared to everyone else. Switzerland does spend more than we do. But again, if the argument is that our schools aren't doing well because of spending, there's a very practical question to ask. If that's true, how much more do we need to spend? Because we're spending a ton already. So is that, it leads you to think, really the problem with American education? And now we're in a state that often has said it's number one, right? We did receive a very high ranking in the Quality Counts report, which is produced by Education Week magazine. But actually, that report focuses mostly on inputs in terms of spending, in terms of policies, in terms of preferred ways of testing. So when the MISPAC was a test that we used to give in Maryland, and it was a performance-based assessment, we got extra points because it was a style of testing that the evaluators preferred. But if you actually look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is a federal program that assesses all the states, and it's a test that no one crams for. It's not like the MSAs or the old MISPAC or anything like that. And you see where we rank in terms of, this is 8th grade math. We're right here about the middle. We're not even proficient, which is where you're supposed to be. And so that's our range right there. Massachusetts actually, most of their kids are proficient. But we're right in the middle. And so that's a surprising fact to people that think that Maryland is number one. Because not only are we number one, but remember, we are one of the most wealthiest and most well-educated states in the nation as well. So you would think, given those advantages, we should be among the top. Now, it doesn't matter which graph you look at. I'll show you one more. So this is actually 4th grade reading standards. And see here, we're really not doing very well. We're really towards the bottom of the pack in that test. And so it doesn't matter if you look at 4th grade math, science, or reading. Those are the 3 subjects. We're average or below in every subject. In fact, we're below in every subject except for 4th grade science, where we are average. So in every subject that they test, except for 4th grade science, in which we are average, we are actually below them. And then they say, okay, well, that's 4th to 8th grade. What about high school? Well, it is true that we do well on the AP exams. We are number 1 in the nation on that. But then if you look at the SATs, we're actually in the bottom 10 or 11 if you count the District of Columbia as a state. So our SATs actually aren't as high as one might expect. And then if you look at going up higher, what happens when kids go into community college? 71% of them need remediation. This is from the Maryland report. It's detailing the remediation rates. And then more than half of the high school graduates who are going to 4-year colleges need remediation. So these are kids who really intended to go all 4 years. You would think, and it does show, that those kids are more academically inclined. The rate is better, but still, most of them are not prepared for college. Those intending to go to college, the majority of them are not actually prepared. So that, looking at that, is a problem with data. Now, there's another thing that we focus on a lot in a classical school, is actually the purpose of education. Forgetting about which students do better or worse, just looking at the purpose of it. And so when Horace Mann started the idea of the public schools, the whole premise of it was that this is to help the nation, it's to sustain the republic. That's the idea behind it. It's not about boosting test scores, it's not about economic competitiveness, it's about sustaining the nation. That was the reason. And here's a great quote from John Gardner, who's a classicist, and he said, at the time the nation was formed, our population stood at 3 million. And we had, out of that 3 million, 6 leaders who were world class: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, and Hamilton. But today, our population stands at 245 million. This quote's a little old, so that number's actually higher now. So we might expect at least 80 times as many world-class leaders: 480 Jeffersons, Washingtons, Hamiltons, etc. Where are they? So that idea and the actual test scores were some of the reasons why we started the charter. The academics weren't good, and then we had also, those of us starting the charter thought that it isn't just about the test scores, it's also about the purpose. What are you trying to do when you create a charter school? It isn't just about boosting the academics, it's also about providing a different kind of education, a kind of education that would hopefully produce great citizens, and even in a few cases produce citizens as great as Washington, Hamilton, Madison, etc. All right, so we took all that data and we started researching different approaches to education that would address these issues, that would improve the test scores and also return us to the purpose that public education was originally started for, which was the sustainment of the republic. And so the question is, what ideas inspired the charter? And there are a lot of them. But before we talk about the ideas that inspired the charter, we should talk about the nature of ideas, because that's an important thing to address first. So the thing about ideas is it's really the only thing that has long and lasting consequences, if you stop and think about it, right? The idea of communism has long and lasting consequences. The idea of democracy has had long and lasting consequences. It's really ideas. We often think that we're immune to ideas. But as John Keynes said, the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are actually more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually slaves of some defunct economist. And it's funny, but it's also really true if you stop and think about it. A lot of the debates that we have in political circles are just rehashes of things that philosophers and economists have been saying for hundreds and thousands of years. And so there's an idea in this slide about ideas about something else, which is, what is the consequence? What if you could understand this? What do you think would happen? How do you think we would be different as a people or as a person? If you knew about these defunct economists and philosophers and others, what do you think the difference might be? That's for you guys to answer.
Everyone wants to follow.
New ideas.
I find other people to follow. Other people to follow.
Right. What it would mean, does anyone else have a thought on?
Yeah, we wouldn't elect Hillary then.
We might make different electoral choices in either direction. But it means that you would actually be a free human being, right? If you are a slave of a defunct economist or a philosopher who you haven't read, who you haven't engaged with, if you just sort of accept those various parts of the intellectual debate as an assumption, and you haven't actually engaged with it, then you are a slave of a defunct economist. And so the idea is, in classical education, you're freeing people. This is all about making you a free human being versus a slave of some idea that you just sort of accepted and never really engaged. So we were very interested in this idea of creating a free citizenry that really engaged with these great works, this great conversation, knew about them, understood them, and then were no longer slaves to them and could decide for themselves what they really believed, rather than accepting just as an assumption ideas that were prevalent at the current time in which they were living. All right, so where did it all start for us? You have the book there on the desk, The Schools We Need. So the first book in our research was by E.D. Hirsch. And he explains how John Dewey and the Progressive School of Education rose to dominance. And he offers this great critique about the thought role of public education. How there's misleading vocabulary, things like constructivism and project-based learning, and other phrases that sound like they're reasonable approaches, but if you kind of dig into them on what they mean, you'll realize that unfortunately many of the education schools have made a lot of folks, parents and others, slaves to these ideas that are from a defunct John Dewey, who people haven't really questioned. And so he does a great job of questioning John Dewey's progressive approach to education and explaining why those ideas aren't very good, not for just everyone, but also in Hirsch's view, he wants to ensure equity and fairness across the spectrum for those who are more affluent and those who aren't. And he makes a very compelling case that this is the best approach, this liberal arts approach, for everyone, because it not only does it free you, but it provides every student, whether they come from an impoverished background or not, with this rich tradition that they wouldn't otherwise get unless they happen to come from a more affluent family that was able to provide that. How many of you have read this or know about this book or heard of it? So definitely, this is the book we always tell parents, if you join the school, please read it, because if you want to understand the critique of regular public schools pretty much everywhere, this is the book to read. And our teachers, I believe, all have a copy of it. If you don't, let me know. I know we're taking inventory, but I think most of them have engaged with this book, and it's a great book to engage with. And I think, was the academic committee doing some book readings that are upcoming in the next year?
Yeah.
So I know that was one of the books that they were looking at as well. All right, so that's the main book. If you pick one book that you read in the next year, that's the one we would recommend. But there are a lot of other influences on our application. One is the Core Knowledge Program, and that book I believe is out there as well. What Core Knowledge does is it provides a great series of lists for every grade level of rich content. And that's different than what you'll find in the regular public schools that typically focus more on process skills, or what they call thinking skills, versus rich content, and really you need both. But what Core Knowledge did is E.D. Hirsch wrote that book as well, along with some others, and he defined a core of knowledge and researched it that basically is the knowledge you need to read the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, to engage in the public conversation. And so these are sort of the main facts that an education person needs to know as he defined it. Now obviously people will debate the specifics, but there's enough common things in there that people, I think it would be widely agreed that this is a pretty good estimate of the core knowledge, as he called it, that a person needs to know. K-12 is actually inspired by core knowledge. So here's the progression, right? You have book 0, the Hirsch book, which Hirsch then wrote Core Knowledge and created a foundation. Then K-12 took a lot of those ideas and put them into an online curriculum, which we also looked at, had a slightly different arrangement. And then the Well-Trained Mind is the book that really has reinvigorated the classical education movement in this country. And so that book basically gave us a framework for thinking about classical education. There are different ways to do it, but in general, the trivium that we talked about is what we do, and we have plugged in all that rich core knowledge content and the K-12 content into a framework that is based on history. So that in first grade it's ancient history, second grade it's Middle Ages, Renaissance, modern, and then European. So what we did is we took the core knowledge content and literally went line by line and figured out what grade it would go into, and used the structure described in the Well-Trained Mind to put it together. We also used, and I did put up here, some exemplary state standards from California and Massachusetts for reading and math that were at the time ranked the best in the country. We also used those. And so we tried to pick the best of the best content and standards to put together our application. Most of what we talked about during the startup phase was the curriculum, when we were talking about what the school is going to be like. We also talked about instruction as well. And we're influenced by ADI, which is the Association for Direct Instruction, and also a lot of reports from the Fordham Foundation on reading instruction and other trends in pedagogy at the time. And so basically, in a nutshell, we decided that the way you make instructional decisions is to the degree that you can determine that something is based in research, that's the way you want to go, versus basing it on a philosophy that says, well, I do this because I'm progressive, or I do this because I'm an educational traditionalist. We wanted to really focus on what research said. Staffing, there's actually, and this may surprise people, there's a National Council on Teacher Quality and Google are the two influences. And the National Council on Teacher Quality has written wonderful reports over the years about teacher quality, what things to look for in an interview, what things to look for in credentials. And then Google has a great interview process. They have a very challenging interview process, and we took that idea and applied it to education. And so our teachers, and two of them are here tonight, will tell you that when you apply to our school, you will take a test in reading or a test in math, do a sample lesson and an interview, and it's a very challenging interview and very challenging test, and the lesson is also has its challenges as well. So the idea is that you really expect, people to engage in an interview process with a more rigorous interview process than most people are used to. And we've had teachers who don't want to come here because of the interview process. So for us, it's been a really useful tool to determine who's really interested in classical education. And then School Culture Kit is a series of charter schools. It's very well known for helping low-income kids achieve very well. Their slogan is work hard, be nice. And one of the things they did in their schools, they had a lot of slogans that they used to sort of crystallize the culture, to kind of remind people what they were all about. We'll talk about that in a little bit. We have some of our own that we borrowed from them. And then GE, General Electric has been ranked many years as the best company to work for in the world, one of the most successful. And a lot of the philosophy and approach that Jack Welch took in his management style are things that we put into how we evaluate our leaders at the school. And then in terms of the charter school law, the Center for Education Reform is the nation's leader in how that, what makes for good law. You guys have heard lots from us on that, so we won't talk about that. And then research. You'll see on the table we have this Why Don't Students Like School? And Daniel Willingham wrote a wonderful book, several books actually, but we just have one for you tonight, about cognitive science, what we know about the brain and how that relates to learning. There are a lot of folks that will claim that such and such an instructional practice is rooted in the brain. That's often not true, but he actually points to things you can actually say. And what was interesting about that is Daniel Willingham's work really correlated with what the core knowledge folks have been saying, which is rich content is a huge part of making sure kids are able to learn. And then the letters training, this is module 1. And definitely if you have a child in K through 2, you would want to consider getting this book. We're actually going to get a copy for the library so parents can check it out and read about the challenge of learning to read. It actually explains how reading works in the brain, and we'll also have a night when we give you some other resources for those grade levels that will help you help your child. And then the purpose of philosophy. So we said that, when we started, well, we were looking at research and evidence, but that ultimately led us to philosophy, which is, okay, we understand instructional approaches and curriculum design work, and we felt that public education had strayed from its purpose, but what was our source for looking at what the purposes of public education might be? And Hillsdale College was very influential to all of us. Several board members went to Hillsdale and went to their seminars. And their purpose is very much, for classical education, very much what our purpose is here, which is we want to sustain the republic. We want citizens to develop who have wisdom and eloquence to be able to engage in a public debate in a more civil way, a more humane way, and also in daily interactions act in a more civil and humane way that doesn't make them the slaves of some defunct economist or philosopher. All right, so part 3. Practical matters. What is our charter? Now, on the table, there is an actual copy of our charter document. So this is our charter document. This is different than the charter school application. The charter is a legal contract, so it's signed by us and the Board of Education. We have all the signatures, and it defines what our roles and responsibilities are. We often get questions, well, what does the board do? Well, this document actually outlines everything we are allowed to do and supposed to. And it also outlines that for Frederick County Public Schools. So this is a good document to look at, and we can send this out in soft copy as well. Good contract, and our contract, as we talked ad nauseum, we don't have the things in here that we really need. Normally you get the ability to operate the school, full funding, including facility. Most of the time you don't get facility, but in the ideal you get facility funding. And the accountability should be based on results rather than adhering to the so-called best practices that others might define. The idea in a charter school is you shouldn't be held accountable for inputs, you should be held accountable for outputs. Are the kids learning? Are they happy? Is the staff doing well? Are they happy? Are parents satisfied? That's what matters, right? Not, well, you adhere to policy regulation 100-whatever. That's not really the focus of a charter school. Charters are supposed to be focused more on innovation and less on rules and regs, with the exception of anything related to health, safety, non-discrimination. Certain basic things you obviously have to follow. But the rest of it, how you operate the school, hiring the staff, any of the operational aspects should in 90% of the cases are actually left up to the charter school operator. All right, and then we often get a question about the budget. And so the regular public schools in their operating budget, so there's two budgets in the Frederick County Public Schools. So there's the year-to-year operating budget, and then when they need to build a new school, new high school, they have a capital budget where they have some Frederick County funds and there's state funds, etc. All right, so this is just talking about half of that, just the operating budget. Okay? We get $0 from the capital budget. We built this building out of this budget. So we start with $12,800 per child. We subtract out $4,000 per child for services that FCPSs provide. Some of those services we want, some we don't. We don't really get to pick. And then what we get is 68%. We get $8,800 by the current numbers. It'll change next year probably, which is only 68%. But I mentioned that there's a whole other budget category called the capital budget that we don't get. So when you factor this in, we have to subtract out another $1,500 in rent per child. That's how much it costs to keep this roof over our heads. $1,500 per child per year, and it goes up every year by 3%. And we have $7,300 left for instruction, which means we're operating a school at 57% of the funds that a regular public school would do it. Now, yes, we get services, but again, we don't necessarily want or need those services. If we were allowed to apply this money towards what the law in Maryland says, 98%, you're supposed to get 98% instead of 57%. There are other things we could do, hire more instructional assistants, etc. Now, we wouldn't necessarily get all the services, but on some of those services we could actually do cheaper and more efficiently or just don't need. And so, anyway, that's how our budget works. We can also break it down other ways, but this is sort of the overview presentation. So just know that we're doing a lot more with less. If you apply this $1,500 in rent to the regular public schools, that means they, in their budget, would have a deficit now of $60 million. They have the equivalent $1,500 expense per child. All right, so here's the school that we proposed. This is actually from the application. It was a well-rounded college-focused instructional program, developing everything: knowledge, reason, self-expression. In the long term, what we want to be nationally recognized is having a replicable model. And there are consequences to having a replicable model because it means you have to write down the lessons that are actually being delivered. It means you have to have a lot more, you have to have things that are repeatable in some way if you're trying to replicate. And so that has some consequences. And the idea is you're going to get a rigorous liberal arts education using well-researched instructional approaches versus, trendy things. And the important thing to emphasize here is, at best, general education is about the unity of knowledge, not distributed knowledge. English should not be in a silo from history. Those two easily go together. Math and science, same thing. And hopefully all of them will be brought together in an integrated way. By the way, that's our charter school application that Tara is bringing to you.
Not this.
No, not the pretzels. But those are, I think that's all 3 volumes of it. Yes. So as you see the stack that's about a foot high or close to it, that's why it's going to take a lot of these presentations to go through this. And so you'll notice also this is, it's not about spreading courses around, it's about making connections between different ideas. It is joining an ancient lineage of the learned and wise. As Dr. Perrin said, a lot of parents these days don't aspire to have their children be wise. It's more about college and career readiness. It's not about being wise, having good judgment. And so our emphasis is more on that. And again, its goal is the goal we've stated, to have a self-reliant, enlightened citizenry. And again, education, true education, should liberate. It cultivates the genuinely free man, a man of moral judgment, intellectual integrity. It gives us the power to see the other side. Wouldn't it be great if we could all see the other side of those who disagree with us? That's what classical education aims for. And it's supposed to impart a nobility of purpose and a kindliness of spirit. So that's the school, the ideals that we hold ourselves to. Now, one of the things that was very interesting is things get lost in the application. So there's about 2 pages in that big stack, these hidden application gems, that we took a page out of Kip's book, and we came up with some slogans to try to simplify some of this, to have folks have like a phrase they could just remember and sort of remember what the school is about. So one is the student hasn't learned, the teacher hasn't taught. And what they mean is students are very much dependent on how instruction proceeds. And so the idea is that the students obviously have to be a willing participant. But the idea is we don't expect students to teach themselves in the way that the progressive tradition does, where they might have project centers and emphasize that a lot, and there's less instruction from the teacher. This is more of a teacher-centered model. And the idea that we're teaching to mastery. Motivation begins with success. So the idea is we don't ever want to overwhelm students with material that they can't handle to start. We want to find where they are, make sure they can do that, then kind of extend them a little bit and extend them a little bit. And with each extension, the idea is you're creating a positive snowball, and that they're always experiencing success from the first time they get in the classroom versus giving something that's so challenging that they're really frustrated with it. The idea is you want to actually make learning easier in the sense that you design instruction to try to reach the students where they are and just extend them a little bit. And then climb the mountain. The idea, this came from the KIPP Charter School, and the idea here with climbing the mountain was just that, what's the point in climbing a mountain? It takes so much effort, it's just exercise, right? And a lot of times academic exercises sort of feel like they're just brain exercises. What's the point of it all? And the idea is that at the end of climbing the mountain, you get to look down and you get to see the view, right? So you understand things you didn't understand before, and you've been elevated to a different place. And so that's what the climb the mountain phrase, the slogan means, is that you're able to have eyes to see things differently after you're an educated person. All right, there are no shortcuts, kind of self-explanatory. There's no royal road to geometry. It doesn't matter who you are, everybody has to go through the same stages and struggles. The thrill of skill is a phrase that we use in contrast to those that were more on the progressive education side that would deride practice as drill and kill. And they would say, oh, this drill and kill, you're making kids practice the math facts too much. Don't have them do practice. But the reality is, or as much practice, that everybody needs practice. It's the only way we really learn. So we say the thrill of skill, because it's not the acquisition of the skill that's fun. It's hard to learn to speak French. I can't do it. But wouldn't it be fun if we all could speak a foreign language? It'd be a wonderful skill. Once you're fluent in it, you can experience the joy of it. So you'll have the thrill of skill. Getting the skill requires hard work. And so the idea is just you combine the idea of motivation begins with success, and the thrill of skill. The idea is that if you set kids up so they're constantly experiencing success, they'll be more and more motivated to gain those skills. And then in gaining them, they'll experience the thrill of knowing something really well, so it becomes so fluent in second nature they can speak French or solve the math problem or understand the science or read the passage. All right, books, not looks. I skipped one. You can't beat the triangle, so the idea is that parents and teachers and kids will all work together as a team to try to make sure that this happens, okay? Triangle is the strongest shape in nature, and which is where this phrase comes from. Books, not looks. We all wear uniforms. The emphasis is on what's within you, not on your external appearance. The idea is, and Larry Kaiser, when he was here, talked about by means of this education, of all this knowledge and these facts and these skills that you're learning, you're giving yourself internal freedom, which then will correspond to the outside world in terms of acting as a free person in the external world. Students come first. Anything we do has to benefit students. We don't focus on what's convenient for us as adults. It's about making sacrifices and taking risks to benefit students. Research trumps philosophy is the idea that, I think I discussed it before, that we did a lot of research to get here, rather than saying, well, we're a classical school, so we'll do classical things, whatever that means. Well, people can define that 1,000 different ways, and that's not very helpful. We teach reading the way we teach reading because it works that way. It so happens that, and classical educators will often be bemused by this, that all the research that has gone into ways in teaching reading are things that classical educators have done for a very long time, and they often find it amusing. Yeah, you rediscovered sort of the way we've been doing things for a long time. But where we differ a little bit in relation to other classical schools is we do really take seriously the idea that you have to research stuff and make sure it works. Even if it was part of the classical tradition, we validate that. And that's one of the unique aspects of our school as compared to other schools, is we really did put in the research to verify that this works. And a lot of the classical folks I know that have read this application are very interested in what we put in there, precisely because we have copious research citation. It's actually very useful to a lot of folks. And then ask the 7 why. So why are you doing what you're doing? In other words, in a classroom practice or operational practice, ultimately it has to benefit students. And so there's this great game that General Electric taught GE managers to do at the time that I was there, and that was whatever you're doing, ask why 7 times. Well, I'm going to the copier to pick up my copies. Why? Well, because that's where the copier is. Why? Well, because that's where they placed it. Why? Right? So you ask enough questions, you can come up with other solutions like, maybe we should put printers in everybody's room so we can print to there instead of walking to the copier, to give an example. Right? So the idea is if you ask enough questions, you could probably come up with a way to improve things. And all you have to do is ask the why 7 times, literally 7 times. It's a fun exercise, and you'll start to think differently about whatever it is that you do. All right. So what is the spirit of the school? So there's a great game that I'm going to play with all of you now, which is the tapping game. I'm sure you guys have played this. I'm going to think of a song, and I'm going to tap it out, and I want you guys to guess what it is, okay? It should be pretty easy, right? All right. Here we go. Ready? So that's part of it. All right, so everybody know what that is? What? Why don't you know what it is? I know what it is. It's so easy for me. Why is it not? Why do you not know?
Mary had a little lamb.
Not Mary Had a Little Lamb. And it's good that I tapped to try and, instead of singing. My wife will verify. Anybody have a guess? Why isn't it easy for you?
Because it's not in our head.
It's not in your head, right? And so that's one of the things that we've struggled with as school is we feel like we've explained some of these things, but the ideas are kind of in our heads still. We need to get it out to everybody else. And so when we're thinking about the spirit of the school, there's sort of a song, so to speak, about classical education. And if you understand the tune, if you sort of understand what it's all about, and you've read a lot of sources, you kind of get the commonalities. And we want to make sure that parents understand those commonalities because that's the tune that needs to be in your head to understand some of the things that we're talking about. And so I think in the last couple of years, as we've been talking about classical education, some parents do absolutely get it and they've done it, but I don't, and a lot of the ones here are the ones that we always see and probably know this stuff. But we feel as a board that we really need to reach out to the larger community and have more of these nights so that everyone understands, because it is your kids' education, and you really ought to understand what's going on. And by understanding what's going on, you get to experience all this really interesting classical education material and approaches and philosophy yourself, which is an education that most of us didn't receive in regular public schools. So the spirit of the school, there's a couple different things that we can do.
Wait, what's the tune?
Oh, sorry.
Tell us the tune.
It was Oh Beautiful. America's Beautiful. Is that what you thought? Yeah, so that was the tune.
Sorry,
right?
I had to know.
It's all right. The music teacher has to know. So writing from our, this is a great speech by William Faulkner. He gave it at the Nobel Banquet in 1950. And it's a wonderful thing that inspired me and sort of is really the spirit of the school in many ways. And it's very long, but I'll point out a couple things about it. So he talked about writing from the heart and how people don't do that anymore. And so the way you write is different. And so he was talking about, he felt this word was made. Can you guys read this, by the way, or is it too small? Okay, so whatever I say, you'll think is true. Right? All right. So he said, he's accepting the word. He said, I feel this word was made to me, not made to me as a man, but to my work, a life's work, in the agony and sweat of the human spirit, not for glory, and least of all for profit, but to create out of the materials of the human spirit something which did not exist before. Really neat language, right? So this award is only mine in trust. It will not be difficult to find a dedication for the money part of it, commensurate with the purpose and significance of its origin. But I would like to do the same with the acclaim, too, by using this moment as a pinnacle from which I might be listened to by the young men and women already dedicated to the same anguish and travail, among whom is already that one who will someday stand here where I am standing. So that first paragraph is really interesting, right? Because he's not talking about himself, just like George Washington didn't, right? Just like our great leaders, the focus was really on posterity. So that's kind of the first thing that I would get out of this writing, is that this is about the future. It's not about us, it's about the future. And then he takes, and I did edit out some things here so that you can't see the ellipses here. He talked about, this was at a time when we were concerned about the Cold War. And he had a few lines about us being concerned that we'd all be blown up, right? So I took that out because it didn't fit and I didn't necessarily need it. But then he says, the young man or woman writing today has forgotten the problems of the human heart in conflict with itself, which alone can make good writing. Because only that is worth writing about, worth the agony and the sweat. So it's if you guys listen to the Hillsdale videos by the English literature professor, who's a brilliant professor, and talks about how hard it is for him to write anything. He's saying this as well. Writing is very hard. It's one of the hardest human activities that we do, because you not only have to know what you're communicating, you have to know how others will receive it, and your choice of language requires vocabulary and empathy and other things. And it's a wonderful pinnacle, really, in classical education, because we emphasize so much about the eloquence of what you write. So anyway, he's saying this has been forgotten. He says he must learn them again. He must teach himself that the basis of all things is to be afraid, and teaching himself that, forget it forever, leaving no room in his workshop for anything but old verities, truths of the heart, old universal truths, lacking which any story is ephemeral and doomed. So he's basically taking on sort of pulp fiction, novels that are just kind of, they're good commercially, but they're not going to be remembered, a few years from now. And he talks about love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. Until he does, he labors under a curse. He writes not of love, but of lust, of defeats in which nobody loses anything of any value, of victories without hope, and worst of all, without pity or compassion. And this is the answer to the question on the email that I sent out. His griefs grieve on no universal bones, leaving no scars. He writes not of the heart, but of the glands. And then he goes on. So this is a really great piece of literature, I think, just this speech, because he talks about things being universal. And what classical education really emphasizes are the things that are in life universal, that are true in every time, not just now, but forever. The challenges with what form of government should we have? How should trade work? These are universal concerns. What is the meaning of life? Those deep questions. What is our purpose? Those are things that are always universal concerns for all human beings. And so let's see here. Let me end with my favorite line. He says, until he relearns these things, he'll write as though he stood and watched the end of man. I decline to accept the end of man. I love that understatement. It is easy enough to say that man is immortal simply because he will endure, that when the last ding-dong of doom has clanged and faded from the last worthless rock, hanging tieless in the last red and dying evening, and even then there'll be one more sound, that of his puny voice, still talking. Really, really neat. All right, so the next thing is the little boxes. So we have the puny, inexhaustible voice, this idea that we're never giving up, that we're going to have poetry be a prop for our students, that is part of our culture. And so this little boxes is a neat little thing you probably heard about. There's a guy that punished his 3-year-old daughter for wasting a roll of wrapping paper because he opened it up and there's nothing in it. And he's like, this is crazy. Why would you waste this paper? And the daughter said, well, all my kisses are in it, right? It's very sweet. I mean, all her kisses were in there. And so he said, that's, he said, let's see here, I have my little notes on it. And he said, oh my goodness, I didn't realize you put your kisses in there. Of course, this is the most valuable thing, right? And so, in a very real sense, each of us have been given a gift, right, with our life here. And we also, in the classical school, have a lot of gifts to give. And the way we look at this classical education is that education is really about giving a gift. It's not about creating academic powerhouse. Obviously, we want a rigorous program. But it's about gift giving, about sharing aspects of the Western and other civilizations that have been lost. And so the classical education movement really is about recovering the ruins, as Dr. Perrin will phrase it, or giving gifts that are these little boxes that haven't been opened in a very long time by a lot of people. And so that's the little boxes. So one way to describe the spirit of the school is to read the poem, the Nobel speech that I just read. The other is described as the school of the little boxes. We're opening up these little nuggets of Western civilization and sharing them again. And then the other is what do you have when you kind of have put all that together and you have a different understanding. You have eyes to see the world differently because of your education, because of your classical education. And T.S. Eliot has a great quote. He says, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we first started and know the place for the first time." And that, I think, is really a powerful idea, that by recovering this classical tradition, by, again, opening up these boxes, we're going to see things differently, and we're going to understand where we are as a culture, as human beings, in a different light. We will actually understand where we are, because you will follow the intellectual currents if you're going through classical education from ancient times to now, and you will understand the great conversation. So it's not as though you just, came here, you were born, and you kind of accept all the assumptions of the culture of the time. You'll actually understand everything that's going on with a different light, because you'll understand the great debate that has gone on before. All right, so that is kind of the spirit of the charter school, which is in some ways countercultural, right? It's in some ways countercultural. It's very easy to go and kind of accept the norms of the day and never question them. But classical education will help you to see that differently. All right, what's the charter's place in life? Kind of a deep question. So one of the things I hope for all of you is this is something that, and I don't probably need to say to the audience, to the folks that are here, you're here because you do think this is a very important thing. But the key question in life is to ask, are you spending your time on the right things? Because time is all you have. And so this charter school, we hope for all of you, and for the parents that aren't here, is something that's worth spending some time on, to really develop it, to really help it, to be what it can be. And Randy Pouch is a really interesting guy. When we looked, Trish and I looked at home, I had the copy of the book out, and I don't know what happened to it. I was going to pass it around. But he wrote a book called The Last Lecture. Does anyone know The Last Lecture story? Yeah, so it's a YouTube sensation. And so the last lecture was basically literally his last lecture. Normally, college professors will give their last lecture, which is the wisdom they would impart to their last group of students, kind of to how they can achieve their dreams, right? And so he gave a last lecture, but he was dying of cancer, so it was literally his last lecture that he would ever give at Carnegie Mellon. And it's a great book. I couldn't do it justice to describe it now. It's a great YouTube video. But basically, what he was saying is, live life to its fullest. The barriers, what was the quote? The walls that you encounter in life are for people who didn't want to get over them as much as you did. Right? Really.